I want you to picture two people. Person A is 38 years old, successful job, has been around the block, seen things. By every traditional definition, he should be the mature one in any room. Person B is 17, still in school, hasn't lived much yet. By every traditional definition, still figuring things out. Now here's the situation. Someone criticizes person A in front of a group. Nothing serious, a small correction. A differing opinion. Person A gets defensive immediately. Interrupts. Brings up something unrelated from 6 months ago. Makes it personal. The room gets awkward. Person B in the same situation says, "Yeah, that's a fair point, I hadn't thought of it that way," and moves on. So, who's the mature one? This already breaks something most people never question. We assume maturity comes with age, like it's something that just accumulates the way seniority or grey hair does. You wait long enough, the switch flips, and suddenly you're wise. But that's not what maturity is. And once you actually understand what it is, you start seeing it, and its absence, everywhere. In adults who should know better. In people your age who somehow already do. Here's the honest truth. Some people are 45 years old and still running a 12-year-old's emotional playbook. And some people your age are already operating in a way that most adults never reach. So what actually separates them? That's what this whole video is about. And here's one more thing before we get into it. If you watched the confidence video, you already know that confidence is about trusting yourself to handle situations. But here's the part we didn't get into. Confidence without maturity is like a sports car with no brakes. Fast, impressive looking, and headed somewhere bad. Confidence helps you act. Maturity helps you choose the right action. Let's figure out what that actually means. Think about every time someone said to you, "You'll understand when you're older. Act your age. You're too young for that." What do those phrases all assume? That time by itself produces wisdom. Like leaving fruit on a counter, eventually it ripens. Except that's not how humans work. Time doesn't produce maturity. Experience processed correctly produces maturity. And here's the part that most people skip over. A lot of adults go through decades of experience and learn almost nothing from them. They repeat the same patterns, make the same mistakes, and tell themselves a story where it's always someone else's fault. I've seen 16-year-olds sit with discomfort better than most adults I know. I've seen teenagers take accountability for things that grown people would have deflected, denied, and blamed on the weather. And I've seen the opposite. 35-year-olds still throwing the emotional tantrums they were throwing at 14, just with better vocabulary. So if time isn't the answer, what actually determines maturity? 3 things. 1, whether your experiences actually challenged you. 2, whether you reflected on them honestly. 3, whether you changed your behavior as a result. That's it. Age just determines how many chances you've had. What you do with those chances is entirely on you. Which means you're not waiting on a birthday. But wait, if experience alone doesn't do it, why do so many adults still behave like children? There's actually a specific reason for that, and it's stranger than you'd expect. I want to describe something that I think you're going to recognize immediately. Group chat. Someone makes a joke at someone else's expense. Not malicious, just banter. The kind of thing that happens 1,000 times a day, but this time the person on the receiving end goes quiet, and then they start posting indirect things. Vague quotes, status updates, little passive signals that say "I'm upset and I want you to notice." Sound familiar? Or this one? Someone gets corrected, doesn't even matter about what, but instead of saying "oh, good point," they double down. Get defensive. Suddenly the conversation isn't about the original topic anymore. It's about winning. About not being the one who was wrong. These are not teenage behaviors I'm describing. These are adult behaviors. The age of the person doing them is irrelevant. The pattern is exactly the same. There's a concept in psychology called emotional regression. When people feel threatened, embarrassed, or out of control, they fall back to older coping patterns. Usually the ones they learned before they had any real tools. And most of those patterns were developed around age 7. Which means that when an adult is making a scene, sending a passive-aggressive message, sulking, guilt-tripping, What you're often watching is a 7-year-old who got really good at disguising it. The disguise gets more sophisticated, the behavior stays the same. And here's why this matters. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. In other people, and more importantly, in yourself. Because the uncomfortable question isn't, do people do this? The uncomfortable question is, when do I do this? Which brings us to the actual definition. Because most people have a vague idea of what maturity means. But a vague idea isn't going to help you build it. Here's the clearest definition I can give you. Maturity is the ability to consistently make good decisions despite emotions, ego, pressure, temptation, or discomfort. Read that slowly. There's a lot in there. Despite emotions, not instead of them. Mature people feel things. They just don't automatically act on everything they feel. Despite ego, this one trips almost everyone up. The ego's whole job is to protect your self-image. It hates being wrong. It hates looking weak. And a mature person has learned to notice when their ego is running the show and to step in before it makes the call. Despite pressure, this is the one where you do something because the room expects it. Maturity is being able to make a choice you actually believe in, even when that choice is uncomfortable to explain. Despite temptation and discomfort, this is where most people struggle most visibly. Doing what's right when doing something easier is available. Here's the analogy I keep coming back to. Maturity is the brakes of a car, not the engine. Intelligence, ambition, talent, those are the engine. They determine how much power you have. But without brakes, that power just takes you wherever momentum is pointing. And momentum almost always points at whatever feels easiest right now. A person with massive intelligence and zero maturity is genuinely dangerous, mostly to themselves. A person with average intelligence and high maturity tends to go further than almost anyone expects. And here's the connection back to confidence. Remember, hollow confidence, the kind built on external things that can be taken away. That exists because of low maturity. When your ego is fragile, you protect it with props, expensive ones, loud ones, anything to signal value instead of actually building it. Without maturity, confidence very easily becomes arrogance. And arrogance, just so we're clear, is not confidence. Arrogance is what confidence looks like when it's scared. So now we know what maturity is, but knowing the definition and actually living it are two completely different things. The gap between them, that's mostly one skill. And it's the one most people get completely wrong. Hey, glad you're here. This channel is pretty simple. We talk about things that actually matter, and we try to be as clear about them as possible. No filler, no vague inspiration. If something doesn't have a real use, we leave it out. Alright, back to it. When most people hear emotional control, they picture someone stone-faced, never reacts, never shows anything, robotic, detached, and they either admire it or find it unsettling. But that's not emotional control, that's emotional suppression. And suppression doesn't work. It just moves things around. Push something down here, it explodes somewhere else later. Real emotional control is something much simpler and much harder. It's the gap between feeling something and acting on it. That's it. Not the absence of emotion, the presence of a pause. Here's what it looks like. Someone says something to you online that's genuinely insulting. Not just rude, actually personal. The immature response comes immediately. Reply fast, reply hard, say something that makes clear they picked the wrong person. The mature response is almost identical internally. You feel the same flash of irritation. Your brain suggests the same devastating comeback. But instead of sending it immediately, you pause. And in that pause, you actually get to choose. Maybe you respond differently. Maybe you don't respond at all. Maybe you realize 2 minutes later that the comment says more about them than it does about you, and you move on. But the point is, it was a choice, not a reflex. Here's a way to think about it. If you get a notification on your phone, it doesn't mean you have to open it immediately. It means something happened and you should look at it when you're ready. Your emotions work the same way. They're information, not commands. Immature people treat emotional signals like commands. Mature people treat them like information worth examining. The goal is not to feel less. The goal is to respond on purpose instead of by accident. Now, the emotional control chapter is about the gap between feeling and acting. But there's something running underneath most of our emotional reactions that almost nobody talks about directly. And until you understand it, you'll keep losing to it without knowing why. This chapter is going to make some of you slightly uncomfortable. That's fine. Slightly uncomfortable is usually where the useful stuff lives. Let's talk about ego. First, ego isn't bad. The ego is your self-concept, the mental model you carry of who you are and what you're worth. Everyone has one. Without it, you'd have no identity, no motivation, no direction. You need it. The problem is when the ego starts running things it shouldn't. Here's what the ego cares about above everything else, and this is the key thing to understand. Not the truth, not what's right, not the long-term outcome. The ego cares about looking okay right now, in this specific moment. And that creates a very particular pattern. Someone proves you wrong. Your ego doesn't process that as great, now I know something I didn't know before. It processes it as a threat, a small wound to the self-image. And it responds the way anything threatened responds, defensively. So you argue, reframe, find a technicality, bring up something unrelated from 3 weeks ago. Anything to avoid the moment of just saying, you're right. Now here's the kicker. 2 people have this exact interaction. One lets the ego drive, one doesn't. The one who said, actually, yeah, I got that wrong, they get to update their understanding and move forward. They learn something. The one who defended to the end, still wrong, just more confident about it. Mature people have figured out something that takes most people years to internalize. Your ego and your identity are not the same thing. You can admit you were wrong and still be completely okay as a person. In fact, the ability to do that is one of the clearest signals of real confidence. The ego wants to win the argument. Maturity wants to solve the problem. Those are not the same goal. And choosing between them tells you a lot about where someone actually is. So if the ego is the thing getting in the way, what does that look like in a real everyday situation? Let's get specific. Someone criticizes your work, your writing, your project, your idea, your decision, something you put real effort into. The immature response: get defensive, point out why the critic is wrong, unqualified or biased, look for their flaws, bring up something they've done badly, feel bad for the rest of the day, tell someone else about it to get validation. Either give up entirely or become weirdly obsessed with proving them wrong. The mature response: separate the delivery from the content. Ask yourself honestly, is there anything true in what they said? If there is, extract it and use it. If there isn't, set it down and move on. Either way, you don't need them to be wrong for you to be okay. Notice that the mature response isn't emotionless. You can feel annoyed, embarrassed, defensive, all of it. The difference is that those feelings don't get to make the decision. Here's something worth thinking about. Criticism from people who are better than you at something is free education. Specific, relevant, free. Paying for that kind of feedback would be the obvious move. Resenting it instead is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make. Now, not all criticism is useful. Some of it is just noise. Someone venting, someone with their own stuff going on, someone who just doesn't like you. You don't have to act on everything, but you do have to be honest enough with yourself to figure out which is which. And that requires something the ego hates: objectivity about yourself. Handling criticism is one thing, but what about when it turns into an actual confrontation? When it's not just feedback, but conflict? That's where you really find out what someone is made of. Conflict is one of the most revealing things in human life. Not because it shows how angry you can get, but because it shows what your actual goal is when things get hard. Most people enter conflict with a hidden agenda: to win, to be right, to have the other person acknowledge they were wrong. And that's understandable, because conflict feels like a threat, and the ego's response to threats is to dominate. But there's a different goal available. One that sounds obvious when you say it out loud, and yet almost nobody actually uses: to resolve it. The immature approach: escalate until someone backs down, go for the jugular, make it personal, make it loud, win. The mature approach: figure out what you actually want from this situation. Is it to be heard, to fix something, to set a boundary? Identify that first, then say it directly, without the performance. Mature people don't avoid conflict. That's a common misconception. They just don't treat every conflict like a war. Here's a question worth sitting with. When you're in an argument with someone you actually care about, what do you want the outcome to be? Probably not for them to feel crushed. But that's exactly what escalation produces. You win the argument and damage the relationship. Then you walk around with this strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. There's a version where you say what's actually true, clearly without cruelty, and then listen to what comes back. That version is harder in the moment. It requires the ego to take a seat. But it's the version that ends with the problem actually solved instead of just temporarily buried. One more thing. The mature person is also comfortable with a resolution that isn't 100% in their favor, because they understand that the relationship or the outcome is often more valuable than the point they were trying to make. Knowing when to let something go is not weakness, it's strategy, and it takes more control than most people realize. So we've covered the emotional side, how to handle feelings, ego, criticism, conflict, but there's another dimension of maturity that's less about emotions and more about time. Specifically, your relationship with the future version of you. If I had to pick one thing that separates people who build something meaningful from people who stay stuck, it would be this. Delayed gratification. The ability to choose a larger reward later over a smaller reward right now. This sounds simple, almost embarrassingly so. And yet, look at how most decisions actually get made. The decision to eat well is constantly beaten by the decision to eat what tastes good right now. The decision to train consistently is beaten by the decision to rest because today was hard. The decision to save money is beaten by the decision to buy the thing that would feel good today. The present is loud, the future is quiet, and the brain is genuinely, neurologically wired to prefer the loud thing. Which means choosing the future over the present isn't natural. It has to be learned, practiced, built. And here's something worth knowing. This kind of maturity doesn't always feel like discipline. Eventually it starts to look like preference. The person who genuinely doesn't want the short-term thing anymore, who has actually changed what appeals to them, that's not willpower. That's someone who has built the future into how they see the present. You can get there, but not by wanting it. You get there by choosing the harder option enough times that it starts to feel like the obvious one. Delayed gratification is really about one thing underneath it all. Ownership. Not just of your choices, but of your outcomes. And that's the last piece of this. Responsibility is one of those words that sounds simple until you actually try to live it. Here's the surface version most people use. Responsibility means doing what you're supposed to do. Show up, don't be late, do the task. The real version is harder. Responsibility means owning your outcomes. Not just your actions, your outcomes. And that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because owning your outcomes means that when things go wrong, the first question you ask isn't, who did this to me? It's, what part of this is on me? Not because everything is your fault. Some things genuinely aren't. Life is unfair in ways that have nothing to do with what you chose. That's real and worth acknowledging. But the habit of looking outward first, of immediately locating blame somewhere outside yourself, is also one of the most reliable ways to stay stuck. Because if everything is someone else's fault, then improvement is always waiting on someone else to change. And that gives you zero control. Mature people do something counterintuitive. They take more responsibility than is probably strictly fair. Not because they're pushovers, but because taking responsibility for things within their influence gives them the ability to actually do something about it. There's a question I keep coming back to. Given this situation, even if it's not my fault, what can I do? That question keeps the focus inside your actual control, and control is where progress lives. Responsible people are predictable in a good way. When they say they'll do something, people don't have to wonder. Being someone whose word actually means something is a basic concept. It's also one of the most distinguishing things you can be. So we have a definition, we have the components. Now the question is, what do you actually do with all of this? Here's the truth. Maturity isn't built in one big moment. It's built in small decisions that almost nobody notices. Every time you pause before reacting, every time you admit you were wrong, every time you choose what's right over what's easy, you're becoming a slightly different person. The goal isn't to become emotionless or perfect, it's to become someone you can trust. Because confidence is trusting yourself to handle a situation. Maturity is what makes that trust real. The gap between who you want to be and who you are isn't closed by motivation. It's closed by repeated choices. And over time, those choices become your character. That's what's waiting on the other side of maturity. Not perfection, just becoming someone you genuinely respect. We'll go deeper on some of these topics in future videos. See you in the next one.